What if I told you a couple adopted 12 children, and not a single one existed on paper? No birth certificates, no records, no explanations, and it all happened in a quiet town where nothing ever goes wrong, until it did. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a place that looked like a Hallmark movie, until the Follings moved in. A chilling case that started with generosity, but ended with secrets so dark, even seasoned investigators refused to speak about them publicly. This is the sinister legacy of the Follings, and it all started in 1978. Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Population, 2,914. The kind of town where the biggest event was a bake sale, where people still left their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors like family. Then came Howard and Margaret Folling. He was a wealthy banker from Pittsburgh. She was a sweet pediatric nurse with a soft voice and a golden smile. They bought the biggest house in town, a rundown Victorian mansion that had been abandoned for 10 years. Locals called it the haunted house on the hill. But the Follings? They transformed it. New roof, painted shutters, manicured lawns. Suddenly, the creepy mansion became the town's jewel. And just when everyone thought it was a fairy tale, the first child arrived. The Follings adopted a child every year. Then another. And another. 12 children in just 15 years. No one ever saw the adoption papers. No one met the caseworkers. No one knew where the kids came from. And here's the twist. Not a single child had a birth certificate. Locals asked questions. The Follings smiled. "We're giving them a better life," Margaret would say. And people believed her. Until they started noticing things. Children who seemed confused about their own birthdays. Kids who didn't know their last names. One child claimed she used to live in another country, but couldn't remember which one. And then came the midnight screams. Neighbors began hearing strange noises at night. Sobbing. Chanting. Once, someone swore they saw a child chained in the attic window. Still, the Follings were protected by their reputation. Until one anonymous tip reached the authorities. The FBI got involved. They arrived quietly. No sirens. No fuss. And what they found inside the Folling mansion was horrifying. Behind the vintage wallpaper was a false wall. Behind that, a hidden staircase. That led to a soundproof room. Inside, they found journals, files, locks of hair, handwritten schedules, all labeled with code names. The children weren't being adopted. They were being experimented on. Trained. Conditioned. For what? No one fully knows to this day. Some say it was a cult. Others say it was trafficking. The truth. Parts of it are still classified. The Follings were arrested. But here's the most chilling part. Only 8 of the 12 children were ever recovered. 4 of them vanished, without a trace. To this day, no one knows what happened to them. And every year on the anniversary of the raid, locals say they still hear the sound of children's voices, coming from that locked basement. So, was it kindness gone mad? A secret operation? Or something far darker? If you thought this was chilling, Elaine Winters lived right across the street from the Follings for nearly 2 decades. She remembers Howard like a character from a movie, impeccably dressed, even when checking the mail. And Margaret? She was pure grace. Elegant, polished, warm. The kind of couple you trust. The kind you'd invite to dinner without a second thought. But behind the perfect image hid something truly monstrous. Howard and Margaret couldn't have children, a fact that devastated Margaret. Elaine remembers her sitting on the porch for hours, just watching other children play. There was something haunting about it, the silent longing. She would have made a wonderful mother, Elaine said. At least, that's what everyone thought. Then, in the summer of 1980, everything changed. The Follings announced they had adopted a baby boy. His name? James. The town celebrated. Neighbors threw a surprise baby shower. The local church held a special blessing. James Folling was perfect, bright-eyed, always smiling. But something was off. Clara Jenkins, who went to church with them, never forgot that blessing ceremony. Margaret wouldn't let anyone else hold James, she said. Not even the pastor. When Pastor Williams reached out to bless the baby, Margaret's eyes turned wild, cornered. Howard had to whisper something into her ear just to calm her down. And even then, she hovered so close to the pastor. She was practically breathing down his neck. At the time, people brushed it off. She's just being protective, they said. A new mother. Long-awaited joy. Who could blame her? But the pattern didn't stop. By 1982, there was a second child, Elizabeth. Then came Thomas, Catherine, William. 5 adopted children, all under 6 years old. All in just 5 years. And that's when eyebrows started to raise. Because in Pennsylvania, adoption wasn't easy. It was slow, bureaucratic, painfully long. Yet somehow, the Follings were collecting children like clockwork. But Howard Folling wasn't just a wealthy man. He was connected. And what started as a dream of family was now starting to look like something else entirely. The Follings had an impeccable reputation in Millbrook. They were seen as heroes, saviors. Here was this wealthy couple taking in children who might have been lost to the system, said Detective Richard Cooper, the man who would later rip open the truth. Who was going to question that? Who would want to? But behind the praise, oddities piled up. None of the Folling children went to public school. Margaret homeschooled them all. The kids were barely seen in town, and never without a parent hovering nearby. No sports, no clubs, no friends, just shadows behind tightly drawn curtains. Patricia Hayes, a former neighbor, tried to reach out. My son was the same age as James, she recalled. He seemed so lonely. I just wanted to set up a simple play date. But every time she asked, excuses. He's sick. Too much schoolwork. We're leaving town soon. Eventually, she gave up. And the kids, they disappeared deeper into silence. And then everything cracked. Summer, 1987. 9-year-old Thomas Folling fell from a tree in the backyard. Snapped his arm badly. But Margaret, a trained pediatric nurse, didn't take him to the hospital. She tried to set the bone herself. It got worse. Fast. The break turned into a compound fracture. The wound became infected. And then the fever hit. Dangerously high. Only then, when it was nearly too late, Howard finally overruled her. He carried Thomas to Millbrook General Hospital, barely conscious, in septic shock. Dr. Sarah Chun was on duty that day. We had to rush him into emergency surgery, she said. We almost lost his arm. There was permanent nerve damage. But the most chilling moment? Thomas never cried. Not once. Not even under anesthesia. And when Dr. Chun gently asked how it happened, Thomas didn't speak. Not until he looked at his father, like he needed permission. The red flags turned crimson when Dr. Chun requested Thomas's medical history. Howard's answer? They were lost in a fire at the adoption agency. But no one could find the name of that agency. No backups. No paperwork. Nothing. And when Dr. Chun pushed for details, Howard snapped. He threatened to transfer Thomas immediately to another hospital, another town. But the questions had already begun. That's when I knew something was wrong, said Dr. Chun. But in Millbrook, accusing a family like the Follings wasn't just risky. It could ruin your career. Still, she filed a report with Child Protective Services. Her claim, possible medical neglect. It wasn't much. No hard proof. Just one terrifying suspicion that something behind those mansion walls wasn't right. The case was handed to David Morris, a CPS worker with no idea what he was walking into. He visited the Folling home, interviewed the parents, observed the children. 3 weeks later, his report landed. No evidence of abuse or neglect. The children? Healthy and well cared for. The house? Clean. Safe. Loving. Margaret explained everything. She said she had medical training. She said she feared hospitals because of trauma from her own childhood. It was convincing. Too convincing. Morris closed the case. And Millbrook, it moved on. From 1988 to 1990, the Follings adopted 3 more children. Robert, and Henry. That brought the total to 8. But by now, the whispers had started. People noticed the family, not because they stood out, but because their children didn't. Patricia Jenkins used to watch them at church. 8 kids, sitting in a perfect row, still as statues. No squirming, no whispering, just staring, like they'd been emptied out inside. And that wasn't normal. Something was wrong. But Millbrook stayed quiet, because the Follings gave money, because Howard sat on charity boards, because smiling monsters wear expensive suits. Then came winter, 1992, and with it, a spark that would reignite everything. A new family moved to Millbrook, Michael and Susan Fletcher, with their teenage daughter, Emily. Just a few doors down from the Follings. Michael was a journalist. Susan, a former child welfare social worker. And Susan, she saw it instantly. Emily, now in her 40s, remembers. Mom spotted it right away. The way the Folling kids flinched at sudden movements, how they avoided eye contact. She'd worked with abused and traumatized kids for years. And those children, they weren't normal. They never made eye contact. Not with strangers. Not with each other. Only with Margaret. Or rather, toward her. Always watching her out of the corners of their eyes. As if waiting for a cue. Like actors in a terrifying play. Susan Fletcher knew the signs. She began documenting everything, quietly and methodically. Every strange glance. Every flinch. Every shadow. And then she made her move. She befriended Margaret. To Margaret, Susan seemed like a kindred spirit. An outsider. A fellow mother. A potential ally. They met for coffee. They laughed together. And slowly, Susan was invited inside. Then it happened. Emily Fletcher remembers the day her mother came home different. She told me about a room on the 3rd floor. A room always locked. But from behind that door, she heard sounds. Shuffling. Muffled crying. Someone was inside. When she asked Margaret, laughed it off. Just old house noises, she said. Just storage. But Susan didn't buy it. Then came the moment that changed everything. Spring 1993. Susan was walking past the Follings house when she looked up and saw a girl in the 3rd floor window. Long dark hair. Pale face. Eyes wide. But as soon as she was seen, she vanished. Susan had met every child in that house. That girl was new. Someone Margaret hadn't mentioned. When confronted, Margaret laughed again. That must have been Elizabeth. Or Catherine. But Susan knew better. Someone else was up there. Meanwhile, Michael Fletcher, Susan's husband, was working on a bombshell. A series of articles on adoption fraud. His investigation uncovered something shocking. Dozens of adoption agencies across Pennsylvania had been shut down in the 80s. For illegal placements. No records. No oversight. No accountability. And the timeline. It matched perfectly with when the Follings began collecting children. Emily remembers her father's words. I can't prove it yet, but it lines up. And then coincidence? Or cover-up? Just weeks after Michael's first article dropped, the Follings adopted again. Twin boys, Peter and Paul, followed by a girl named Mary. Their child count 11. And once again, no delays. No red tape. The adoptions went through with alarming speed. Detective Richard Cooper looked back and saw the pattern. They were exploiting the system. Masterfully. Moving across state lines. Using their past adoptions as credibility. Every child added to their shield. They weren't building a family. They were building a fortress. They weren't your average adoptive parents. They asked for the children that nobody wanted, kids. With no files, broken backgrounds. Children who were nearly invisible to the system. But why? Why would the wealthy and reclusive Follings family specifically request the forgotten ones? Margaret Folling always said she wanted a big family. And on the outside, she looked the part. Loving. Gentle. The perfect mother. Her husband Howard? Quiet. Distant. But he never said no to her. They didn't need the money. They didn't want the spotlight. In fact, their massive household made them stand out in all the wrong ways. And then, just when no one was paying attention, the truth began to claw its way to the surface. Fall 1994. Susan Fletcher, Margaret's closest friend, is diagnosed with breast cancer. She only has months to live. And with death approaching fast, Susan makes a decision that would change everything. Late one night, she calls Junior Detective Cooper to her bedside. She's frail, barely speaking. But what she hands him is chilling. A file. Pages of notes. Timelines. Photos. Handwritten observations. She had been watching the Follings for years. She had seen something, someone, in a 3rd floor window. A child that wasn't accounted for. A face that shouldn't have existed. And now, she needed someone to act. I need you to promise me, she whispered. Don't let this die with me. Susan Fletcher passed away on June 12, 1995. And Cooper, he kept that promise. But he moved carefully. The Follings had powerful friends. Accusing them of something sinister, it could cost him his career. So he started small. Public records, property deeds, tax filings, anything tied to the Follings. And then boom, a breakthrough. Despite sealed adoption records, Cooper uncovered that the Follings had worked with 5 different agencies across 3 states. Each time, The pattern was the same. They made their move quickly, and, just like that, another child vanished into their house. But something didn't add up, because with each adoption, something darker was being hidden. And what Cooper discovered next would leave the town of Millbrook reeling in horror. Every time the Follings adopted a child, they made a substantial donation to the agency involved. It wasn't illegal, but it was definitely unusual. And that's not all. Cooper uncovered something chilling. Howard Folling had created trust funds for every adopted child. On the surface, it looked like generosity, but the fine print told another story. The money could only be accessed when the child turned 25, and only if they followed strict conditions. Stay in contact with their adoptive parents, and never search for their biological roots. This wasn't love. It was control. Armed with this disturbing truth, Cooper got bolder. He started surveillance, drove past the Folling mansion regularly, took notes. He interviewed neighbors, teachers, anyone who had interacted with the children. And one pattern emerged over and over. The staff never lasted. Housekeepers, nannies, gardeners. They came and went like whispers. 6 months, maybe a year, and then they vanished. No notice. No forwarding address. Gone. But then came the breakthrough. One name, Maria Vasquez. She had worked for the Follings in 1991 and disappeared. Cooper found her in a small Ohio town living under her maiden name. When he asked about the Follings, she went cold, shut down, until he showed her Susan Fletcher's file. Her eyes filled with tears. "So someone else knows," she whispered. "Someone else saw it too." And then she began to speak. The truth was worse than anyone had imagined. Maria said the children were trapped in a twisted nightmare of rules and punishment. Their lives were scripted to the minute, rules that changed constantly, just to keep them afraid. They couldn't play. They couldn't speak freely. Each was confined to their own room, forbidden to interact. They weren't allowed to call them mom or dad, only sir and madam. But the horror didn't stop there. The third floor, always locked. 3 rooms. Maria was told to leave food outside the doors 3 times a day. She was never allowed to enter, but she could hear them. Small voices, whispers, crying, children, hidden. And what Cooper would discover next would shake Millbrook to its very foundation. Sometimes, Maria said, they weren't just crying. They were singing. Quietly, softly, like lullabies sung to no one. When she finally got the courage to ask Margaret about it, Margaret replied coldly, "They're special needs children. Isolation is for their safety." But Maria knew better. The moment that broke her, one night, she witnessed Margaret punish 11-year-old James just for speaking during dinner without permission. The punishment, he was forced to stand in a corner all night. Margaret checked on him every hour, just to make sure he hadn't moved an inch. Maria was done. That night, she packed her bags and disappeared before sunrise. Not because she feared losing her job, but because she feared what the Follings might do to her if they knew she disapproved. With Maria's chilling testimony and Susan Fletcher's years of secret notes, Cooper had enough. It was time to act. He brought everything to his boss, Chief Raymond Wallace, expecting backup. But what he got was a wall. "Drop it," the chief ordered. Not enough evidence, he claimed. And besides, Howard Folling was untouchable. Friends with the mayor, the district attorney, half the town council. The chief even accused Cooper of letting his emotions cloud his judgment. But Cooper wasn't backing down. If the department wouldn't help, he'd do it alone. He kept his notes at home, did his digging off the clock. The question that haunted him: who were the children locked on the 3rd floor? They weren't among the 11 adopted kids. So who were they? Then, unexpectedly, a new ally stepped in. Emily Fletcher, Susan's daughter, just 19, a journalism student, like her father. And she had been digging too. Emily noticed something terrifying. In the same regions where the Follings adopted children, another child would go missing within weeks. And these weren't just any kids. They were the forgotten ones. Foster kids, children of addicts, kids from migrant families, children who didn't have someone watching, who wouldn't be missed right away, whose stories wouldn't make headlines. And when Emily showed this data to Cooper, he used his law enforcement access to verify her theory. And what he uncovered next would blow this entire case wide open. Not one of those missing children was ever found. And in every case, the investigation was nothing more than a formality. A few questions. A closed file. It was like they didn't even matter, Cooper said bitterly. Like they were disposable. That was the moment he realized he had to go above Chief Wallace. So he did. He compiled everything: Vasquez's gut-wrenching testimony, Susan Fletcher's hidden journals, Emily's chilling research, and his own investigations, and sent it straight to someone he could trust. Lisa Harper, a former colleague, now part of a state task force on crimes against children. She didn't hesitate. Within a week, Lisa had a warrant to search the Falling estate. But a piece of paper wasn't enough. Getting in, that would be the most dangerous operation of Cooper's life. We had to strike fast, Cooper said. If they knew we were coming, they could destroy evidence. Or worse, hurt the kids. But there was a bigger problem. The Follings had connections. Deep ones. If anyone tipped them off, the whole thing would collapse. So Lisa pulled in a trusted task force, state troopers and agents from the DOJ's newly formed Child Exploitation Unit. Cooper would serve as their local guide. The plan? Hit the house at dawn, while the family was still asleep and vulnerable. October 23, 1995. A fleet of unmarked vehicles rolled toward the Follings mansion in the cold gray morning. As the first light cracked through the trees, they surrounded the house. Then a knock on the door. Howard Follings appeared, wrapped in a silk bathrobe, calm as ever. No fear. No confusion. Like he had been expecting them. He acted like we were invited guests, Cooper recalled. He knew. Somehow he knew. But Margaret? She snapped. She screamed that the officers were traumatizing her children. She clawed at one of the female agents. They had to restrain her. And inside, the house was divided into zones. Each team was assigned a floor. They began their search, room by room, starting with the 11 children the Follings had publicly adopted. But what they were about to find would go far beyond anything in Cooper's worst nightmares. When the officers entered the children's bedrooms, they froze. All 11 children were already awake, already dressed, sitting perfectly still on the edges of their beds, as if they'd been waiting. Not a single tear, not a flicker of emotion. They didn't even look at us, Harper later said. No fear, no curiosity, nothing. It was like their souls were gone. And when they were questioned, every answer was scripted. Even 17-year-old James, old enough to speak for himself, just recited, "Sir and Madam provide everything we need. We are happy here." But nothing could have prepared them for what was hidden upstairs, the third floor. Just like Vasquez warned, there were 3 locked doors. They kicked them open, and inside, they found 3 more children. A girl maybe 10, 2 boys around 8. But these children were different. They didn't sit still. They didn't smile. They screamed. They cowered in corners, trembling, hiding their faces from the light. And the smell. It hit the officers like a wall. These rooms were nothing more than prison cells. Bare mattresses. No toys. No books. No color. Just darkness, rot, and silence. Windows boarded with blackout curtains nailed shut. They had been living in their own filth, Cooper said, his voice cracking decades later. And the truth got even worse. All 3 children were severely malnourished. Their small bodies showed obvious signs of abuse. But the most chilling fact? They didn't speak English. Not fluently. Not naturally. They weren't just hidden. They were stolen. No birth certificates. No adoption papers. No records at all. They were ghosts, Cooper whispered. Children erased from the world. This was no longer a case of abuse. This was something darker. Something organized. The FBI was called in immediately. The investigation exploded into federal charges. Kidnapping. Human trafficking. Falsifying federal documents. Howard and Margaret Follings were arrested on the spot. But as they were being led away, Margaret snapped. She broke free from the officer and bolted to the staircase, her voice shrieking in an unearthly language. No one could understand it. Later experts claimed it was glossolalia, speaking in tongues, a phenomenon sometimes linked to religious ecstasy or a complete psychological collapse. But in that moment, it didn't feel holy. It felt cursed. And what came next would uncover a truth even darker than they imagined. That was the moment Cooper's instincts screamed louder than the silence around him. Something about the way the children moved, the way they recoiled, not from fear alone, but from something learned, something conditioned. Until then, he thought Margaret Follings was just a control freak, obsessed with sculpting a picture-perfect family from broken pieces. But that moment on the staircase, it tore a hole in that theory. What he saw felt darker, older, almost sacred. He didn't say it out loud yet, but a seed had been planted. This wasn't just manipulation. This was ritual. And he was right. As investigators dug deeper, what they uncovered stunned even the most hardened federal agents. With Margaret and Howard Follings in custody, attention shifted from horror to healing. But healing would prove far harder than they ever expected. 3 children, feral, trembling, nearly mute, were discovered locked away on the 3rd floor. Emergency foster care took them in. Meanwhile, the 11 legally adopted children were moved to a specialized trauma group home. But helping them? That was a different battle altogether. The 11 were rehearsed, like actors stuck in a bad play. Their words robotic, their eyes blank. No matter who questioned them, their responses never changed. It was like someone had pressed repeat on a script drilled into their minds. But the 3 hidden children, they were a different kind of broken. They couldn't speak. They wouldn't look anyone in the eye. They reacted to sudden movements as if expecting to be struck. And the moment anyone tried to separate them, they collapsed into panic, screaming, clawing, holding each other like life jackets in a storm. They only trusted each other, said Dr. Evelyn Marrero, a child psychologist brought in to break through the silence. And in time, she understood why. These children had been kept in a world where only each other existed, where the only outsider was Margaret, and she came bearing terror masked as healing. As therapy slowly coaxed fragments of memory out of the fog, the truth emerged, not through words, but drawings, symbols, shadows. Margaret had administered what she called treatments, bitter liquids forced down their throats that made them drowsy, sluggish, compliant. Once they slipped into unconsciousness, she would begin chanting, reciting strings of words that no child understood, but all of them felt. Sometimes she painted symbols onto their bare skin, elaborate, swirling shapes drawn with a thick, dark substance, ink or blood. No one could say for sure. The rituals were precise, repetitive, sacred in Margaret's mind. Dr. Marrero was clear. This wasn't tied to any known faith. It wasn't Christianity. It wasn't paganism. It was Margaretism, something she built for herself, a private religion, and the children were her followers. While Dr. Marrero struggled to untangle the scars in their minds, Cooper and the federal team went hunting for physical proof. They tore through the house, floor by floor, files, photos, journals. But it wasn't until they reached Howard's study that they found the lock to Margaret's madness. Behind a false wall, sealed tight, they uncovered a hidden safe. And what they found inside would finally connect every ritual, every child, and every secret the Follings had ever buried. Inside that hidden safe were the final pieces of the puzzle, pieces that shouldn't have existed. Multiple sets of falsified adoption papers, dozens of names erased from official systems. Alongside them, stacks of cash in foreign currencies, yen, euros, francs, enough to suggest escape plans or bribes. But none of it compared to what lay beneath. A single leather-bound journal, handwritten by Margaret herself. It was old, worn by time and use. 20 years of madness carefully inked into every page. And what it revealed shattered even the last thread of normalcy. Margaret Follings wasn't just controlling. She was on a mission, a divine quest, at least in her mind. She believed children were born with sin, real, tangible darkness that had to be purged before they could ever be pure. The process stripped them of everything: names, families, identity, memory, then remake them into blank slates, ready to receive her version of truth. To Margaret, this wasn't abuse. It was salvation. Cooper couldn't believe what he was reading. She thought she was saving them, he said later. In her mind, she was the redeemer, a spiritual surgeon cutting away the rot of their past lives. The journal got worse. She had divided the children, coldly, deliberately, into two categories, the redeemable and the vessels. The redeemable were the 11 adopted kids, those she believed could be reshaped. They were subjected to harsh discipline, forced indoctrination, and isolation. But the vessels? They were never meant to be saved. These were the 3 feral children found locked away upstairs, and others before them. To Margaret, the vessels were already corrupted, unsalvageable. But they had a purpose. They were her sin-eaters. Margaret believed she could transfer the darkness out of the redeemable children, extract their evil, and force it into the vessels through dark, ritualistic acts. That's what the treatments were. The bitter liquids, the chanting, the painted symbols. It wasn't just punishment, it was a ritual of transference. Margaret believed that once a vessel was full, once they had absorbed all the evil, they were no longer useful. She would look into their eyes and know. And then they'd be discarded. The journal never described how, but one phrase came up again and again: the resting place, where the filled ones sleep until judgment day. That single line changed everything. Investigators launched the most horrifying phase of the entire case, the search of the Follings estate grounds. At the very edge of the wooded property, cadaver dogs halted, alerting to a place that, to human eyes, looked untouched, peaceful. What they uncovered was anything but. Beneath the earth, buried in shallow graves, were the remains of 5 children. No markers, no names, just small, smooth stones resting atop each disturbed grave. The medical examiner dated the oldest to 1981, just after the Follings first began adopting. And the others? No records, no birth certificates, no missing persons reports. They were ghosts. And finally, the world began to see the full horror of what Margaret had built. Not a home, not a family, but a private cult of purity. And children were the sacrifices. Howard, however, would not escape justice so easily. Despite his defense team's efforts, the jury saw through the polished image of a detached businessman. Testimonies from surviving children, now adults, painted a far darker picture. They described Howard as a cold, calculating presence in the household. He may not have conducted the rituals, but his authority was absolute. He enforced Margaret's rules, ensured silence was kept, and punished defiance. With clinical detachment, his absence was never a mercy. It was a reset, a momentary pause in the cycle of horror before it began again. In the courtroom, Howard remained emotionless. No apologies, no explanations, just silence, the same silence he had demanded from those children for decades. He was convicted on multiple counts: conspiracy to commit fraud, child endangerment unlawful, imprisonment, and accessory to murder. The judge, in a rare break from composure, called his crimes a betrayal of humanity cloaked in the facade of family. Howard was sentenced to life in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. And yet, the story didn't end with their sentencing. During the cleanup of the Follings estate, a contractor discovered a second crawlspace, this one hidden behind a bookcase in the basement. Inside were videotapes, hundreds of them, unlabeled, dust-covered. Many deteriorated beyond recovery, but the few that were salvaged revealed hours of disturbing footage. Children sitting silently in the dark, reciting prayers Margaret had written, rituals being performed. Some footage was time-stamped in years that predated any official adoption records. It confirmed what investigators feared, that the known victims were only part of a much larger, much older pattern. To this day, the full extent of the Follings' actions remains unknown. The case files are sealed. The names of surviving victims are protected. And in a quiet corner of Pennsylvania, the Follings estate still stands, boarded up, overgrown, and avoided by the locals. There are those who say they've seen lights flickering in the upper windows at night, or heard faint whispers from within the trees near the gravesite. Most dismiss it as imagination, a lingering echo of horror too vast to comprehend. But others aren't so sure, because the final tape ever recovered, though badly damaged, ends with a chilling phrase, spoken in Margaret's unmistakable voice. "We are not done." They struck a deal with the devil. After his last ploy to pin it all on Margaret failed, Howard Falling changed tactics. His lawyers, cold, calculated, relentless, approached the prosecution with an offer that no one wanted to accept, but no one could ignore. Howard would talk. He said there were more children, more bodies, more victims buried in places no one had thought to look. Not in the house, but hidden across state lines, in remote corners, forgotten properties, secret graves. U.S. Attorney Meredith Lane knew what this meant. It was disgusting, she later said, but it was a terrible choice. Give a monster a lighter sentence, or bring lost children back to their families. So they signed the deal. Howard Falling pled guilty to multiple counts: child endangerment, kidnapping, falsifying federal documents. In return, he received 25 years to life, but he'd be eligible for parole in just 20. And then came the reveals. One by one, guided by Howard's testimony, law enforcement teams swept across the East Coast, digging through memories and soil. First, a lake house in upstate New York, then a crumbling cabin deep in West Virginia, and finally a quiet, salt-washed beach house on the Maryland shore. At each location, they uncovered the unimaginable: 3 burial sites, 8 more children, 13 victims in total, 13 vessels for 12 redeemable children. Because in Margaret Falling's twisted theology, some vessels broke before they could be filled. Her madness had rules, sick arithmetic. Some souls fill up too fast, Cooper recalled her saying. And the horror wasn't over. Of those 8 new victims, 5 were finally identified. Lucia Diaz, 9. Wami Johnson, 7. Tran Nangwin, 10. Sarah Blackfeather, 8. Dmitry Kowalski, 6. All stolen from struggling families. All missing between 1983 and 1992. All vanished from communities where law enforcement barely had the resources to file the reports, let alone investigate. The Fallings knew exactly what they were doing. Lane said. They preyed on invisibility. They hunted where no one was looking. They didn't just manipulate the system, they used it, exploited the very blind spots that allowed them to adopt their so-called redeemables without question. And what became of those 12 chosen children? Some survived, but survival came at a cost. James, the oldest, the one who remembered everything, ended his own life in 1998. Elizabeth developed a severe eating disorder and spent most of her adult life in treatment facilities, struggling with the ghosts of her past. And Thomas, the boy whose broken arm first drew suspicion, disappeared the moment he turned 18. No one has seen him since. The damage wasn't just physical. It was spiritual, eternal. And the question lingers, what makes a child redeemable? And how many were lost for Margaret Falling to find salvation? This story didn't end with arrests. It ended in bones and trauma and in unanswered prayers. And the worst part? Some of those prayers were never even whispered, because some of those children, Jane Doe, John Doe, died without names, without candles, without mourning, as if they never existed at all. Some of the children were never found. They simply vanished, faces frozen in outdated posters, names whispered in empty homes that never healed. But a few survived. The youngest were the most fragile. Many ended up in new homes, carrying invisible wounds into families that couldn't always understand the weight they bore. Others were left to age out of the system, never adopted, drifting into adulthood like ghosts of what should have been. Dr. Mororo didn't mince words. They were brainwashed, deeply. They were taught that purity came only through suffering, and that their suffering made them worthy. That kind of belief doesn't vanish. With a few therapy sessions, it scars the soul. Then came the miracle. On the 3rd floor of that cursed house, hidden behind rotted insulation and a false wall, they found them, 3 children, barely alive, nearly forgotten. Sofia Herrera, 10. Mateo Herrera, 8. Carlos Herrera, 8. They had been missing for over 2 years, taken from a rural camp near San Diego while their parents, migrant workers, were out in the fields. Their disappearance had been brushed aside. Local police assumed they'd simply moved on, like so many families who slipped through the cracks. But they hadn't moved on. They had been taken, and they were almost lost forever. If we had waited just a few more months, Cooper's voice cracked. Sophia was already described in Margaret's journal as nearly filled. That meant one thing. She was next. She was hours from being discarded. But fate moved faster. Sophia, Mateo, and Carlos were reunited with their family. A moment that stunned even the most hardened agents. A flicker of light in a tale drowning in darkness. Howard Falling died in prison in 2011, 16 years into his sentence. No remorse, no apologies. His final words, according to the warden, were chilling. I only ever wanted to help Margaret build her family. His estate, with several $1 million, was seized and divided among the surviving victims through a brutal civil battle. Blood money. But for many, it funded the therapy and support that had been denied to them for so long. The house on Elm Street? Demolished. In its place, a garden now grows, wildflowers and lanterns in the soil that once it screams. Each year, on the anniversary of the arrest, the people of Millbrook gather there. In silence. In grief. In remembrance. 13 lanterns are lit. 12 candles follow. Each one a life that was either ended or shattered. It's not justice, Cooper says. Nothing will ever be enough. But it's something. It says we see you. We remember. And we're sorry that we looked away for so long. The aftermath changed everything. In 1998, Pennsylvania passed the Falling Act, sweeping reforms that shook the adoption system. Stricter background checks, limits on how many children could be adopted at once, mandatory home inspections, oversight that never existed when the Fallings began their twisted experiment in salvation. Because in the end, it wasn't just one home that failed these children. It was every system meant to protect them, and the echo of their suffering still haunts the walls of a town that finally dared to remember. They were trusted, respected, untouchable, but behind closed doors, they buried secrets, literally. This is the terrifying untold story of how a wealthy, influential couple used their status to hide one of the darkest child abuse scandals in modern history, and how the system let it happen. And the worst part? There may be more victims still undiscovered. Imagine adopting a child, only to become their executioner. 4 or 5 years, no one noticed, not the neighbors, not the doctors, not the police. Because the people behind it? They had money, charm, and everyone's trust. But when the truth came out, it shattered the nation. Lane, one of the lead investigators, didn't hold back. We all failed them, he said. The neighbors saw something, but said nothing. Doctors noticed bruises, but didn't press. Officials were blinded by Howard's wealth. And even we, the law enforcement, brushed off early warnings. Warnings like the one from Susan Fletcher, ignored, dismissed, until it was too late. But the terror didn't stop with what they found, because Howard only confessed to the children buried on their properties. But the family had traveled extensively. They had connections in multiple states. And the question that haunts every investigator today is, how many more are out there? Unmarked, unnamed, unfound. Cooper, a retired detective, still can't let go. I haven't made peace with it, he says, because somewhere, parents still don't know what happened to their kids. So even after retirement, he goes back to the files, again and again, following every cold lead, opening every closed case, because those children deserve names, and the names we do know: Maria Gomez, Terrell Washington, Alex Petro, Lucia Diaz, Quayme Johnson, Tran Guan, Sarah Black, Feather, Dmitry Kowalski, all brutally murdered. Their stories forgotten by most, but not by us. And then there are the nameless. Jane Doe number 1, John Doe number 3, 3 others with no identity, no family, no justice. But this episode isn't just about what happened. It's about why it happened and how it was allowed to. Decades later, people still search for the root of Margaret Follings' terrifying beliefs. She wasn't just cruel. She was ritualistic. Religious studies expert Dr. Eliza Montgomery spent years decoding Margaret's journals. And what she found? A chilling mix of pseudo-religious dogma. Sin, cleansing, purification through suffering. But it didn't come from any church. It came from her. Margaret Phelps. Born 1945. Raised on a secluded farm in Minnesota. Locals say the family was strange. Religious, but in a way no one could explain. They skipped school. Avoided neighbors. Practiced something, but no one knew what. When Margaret left for nursing school, she cut off her family forever. No holidays. No visits. No one even came to her graduation. She vanished into the world. Quiet. Brilliant. Obsessed with children. But between her 1965 graduation and her 1976 marriage to Howard, there's a black hole in her timeline. She moved from hospital to hospital, worked across the Midwest, even spent time in Europe. But why? What was she looking for? What did she learn? Some believe she found obscure texts abroad, scripts about ritual sacrifice, purification through torment. And when she returned, she was no longer just Margaret. She became something else entirely. The Falling case reminds us, evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a smile, drives a nice car, and donates to charity. And the children who suffer? They fade quietly, unless we tell their story. Resolution. To the victims we've named, your lives meant something. To the ones we haven't, we will never stop searching. This was Sanctified Sin. And if you know something, anything, call the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, 1-800-THE-LOST. Because even decades later, the truth still finds a way to surface. Stay vigilant. The darkest deeds often hide in the most respectable places. But how did Margaret become this? This wasn't just cruelty. It was doctrine. Investigators found something disturbing. Ancient manuscripts hidden in her possession. Not from libraries, from shadowy corners of forgotten history. Some dated back to the 17th century, filled with cryptic teachings on alchemy, Gnosticism, and a dark concept known as spiritual transference. The belief that sin or virtue could be transferred from one person to another, or worse, into another. These weren't Bible verses. They weren't even readable to most scholars. They were deliberately sought out, fragmented, coded, and dangerous. Dr. Eliza Montgomery, a religious historian, studied them. She was chilled. Margaret didn't stumble onto these ideas, she explained. She searched for them. She believed in them. By the time Margaret met Howard Falling at a charity gala in Pittsburgh, 1975, the doctrine was fully formed. She had her gospel. And Howard, he had money. He wasn't religious. He was obsessed with status, control, and power. The perfect match. Now here's where it gets eerie. Howard claimed he thought Margaret only wanted to adopt because she couldn't have children. He said her rituals didn't surface until years later, when he was too involved to walk away. But retired Detective Cooper isn't buying it. 15 years in that house? With those sounds. That's secrecy. He leans in. You'd have to be blind, deaf, and brain dead to not notice. And Howard was none of those things. Dr. Montgomery has a different take. She thinks Howard knew, but saw it as harmless eccentricity. Love can blind, she said, especially when it's laced with charm and seduction. And in the beginning, Howard did love her, or at least, the version she presented. But eventually, love turned into something else, enabling, because whether he believed in Margaret's twisted theology or not, he funded it, he protected it, he made it possible. Quick adoptions, isolated properties, burial plots with no questions asked. Margaret built the altar. Howard laid the foundation. They were a perfect storm, Cooper whispers. And storms like that leave bodies in their wake. 25 innocent kids. One twisted woman. A house with secrets so dark, only one survivor dares to speak. This is the story so disturbing, it was almost erased from history. But today, we're opening the door. At the center stood Margaret Follings, a woman with a chilling vision. Alongside her was Howard, a man with the money to bring it all to life. Together, they built a nightmare. 25 children, handpicked, separated, categorized. 12 were labeled redeemable, adopted into the household, dressed like dolls, and trained to obey. But the cost? Years of psychological torment and brutal punishments. Every mistake was a sin. Every sin, a strike closer to something worse. Then, there were the others. 13 children, the vessels. Locked away, neglected, starved. Margaret believed they had absorbed the evil from the adopted ones, so she eliminated them. Of the 12 adopted, only 9 are alive. James took his own life. Thomas vanished, never found. Catherine overdosed at just 28. The remaining 9 changed their names, disappeared from the spotlight, except one. Her name is Elizabeth. In 2015, she stepped into the light to share what hell looked like behind the Follings family's closed doors. And what she said will haunt you. We were always scared, Elizabeth whispered to the camera. Not of monsters, of Sir and Madam. Rules changed every day. One slip, and punishment came fast and cruel. But the worst part? The rituals. A circle drawn on the floor. A cup of vile tea. A finger, cold and wet, pressed to their foreheads. Foreign words that echoed like spells. Sometimes, Margaret would cut them. Not deep. Not enough to leave scars. Just enough to collect blood. In a silver cup. She called it cleansing. Told them their real parents had infected them. That their souls were diseased from birth. And only she could fix them. If you resist, Margaret warned, the sin inside you will take over. And then you'll go upstairs. Upstairs, where the bad children lived. The vessels. Elizabeth remembers that door. A small window. She was dragged there alone. Forced to peek. And what she saw. Emaciated bodies. Eyes wide with hunger and fear. Covered in filth. That was the fate that awaited those who disobeyed. The Follings house is empty now. Margaret is gone. Howard vanished. But the scars left behind? They're very real. Only one voice speaks for the 25 children now. And through her bravery, the truth survives. So the world can finally say never again. But what if I told you? This wasn't the only case. There's another house, even worse, and it's still standing. Click here to uncover that one next. They look dead already. Their eyes hollow. Empty. Like the light of childhood had been snuffed out long ago. And then, Margaret would whisper, "This is what happens when the sin takes over." That wasn't just a warning. It was a sentence. Inside that house, behind those well-kept walls, 25 children were living in a nightmare factory disguised as a home. They didn't just lose their innocence. They lost reality itself. Food, love, truth. Everything came from one source, Margaret and Howard Follings. The children couldn't breathe without permission, couldn't think without fear. "She'd make us drink this tea that tasted like poison," Elizabeth said. "Then she'd press her cold, wet finger to our foreheads and whisper words we didn't understand. And if you resisted, you got the upstairs treatment, a chilling phrase that meant one thing. She'd take us up one by one and make us stare at the vessels. Thin, dirty, broken. Their bodies were still there, but their souls, gone. This wasn't just abuse. This was ritualized psychological warfare. Cut off from the world, these children had no books, no TV, no friends, just Sir and Madam. They defined truth and lies, sin and purity, reality and illusion. And over time, the kids stopped asking questions. They started believing. Dr. Mororo, a cult expert, later explained, this wasn't Stockholm Syndrome. It was deeper. These kids didn't miss the real world. They'd never seen it. Some never escaped the mental prison. James took his own life. Catherine died of an overdose. Thomas vanished and was never found. And the rest? They survived, but they didn't live. Even now, decades later, they're haunted, living under new names, hiding from a past too twisted to face. Elizabeth is the only one who speaks. But even she breaks when she remembers. The worst part, she whispers, We thought we were lucky. We thought we were the saved ones. Because in the Follings house, love was pain, punishment was salvation, and silence was safety. The real horror? This didn't happen in a remote compound. It wasn't hidden in some underground cult bunker. It was in a normal home, on a normal street, with neighbors, school visits, Christmas decorations. The nightmare lived in plain sight for years, and nobody saw it. Or maybe they just didn't want to. In a picture-perfect American town, there was a family everyone trusted. They went to church. They waved at neighbors. They baked for fundraisers. But behind their white picket fence was a house of horror. Meet the Follings, a family so ordinary, no one suspected a thing. Howard served on local boards. Margaret volunteered. They were the couple people called pillars of the community. And for nearly 20 years, that's exactly how they got away with it. Police car light, what were they hiding? Dr. Chin noticed something strange after treating young Thomas for a suspicious injury. Susan Fletcher raised red flags after observing disturbing behavior in the home. But their warnings? Ignored. Why? Because no one wanted to believe that evil could live next door. A neighbor saw something weird, but didn't want to get involved. An official heard concerns, but accepted a lie because the truth was too dark to face. A colleague felt uneasy, but stayed quiet to protect their career. Collision, and that silence was deadly. These weren't just mistakes, they were micro-failures of courage. Multiplied over years, they created the perfect storm. A town that looked safe on the outside, but was rotting from within. And according to investigator Cooper, this is still happening. Today, when abuse is suspected, someone shrugs it off, saying, "It's not my business." Someone reports it, but when nothing changes, they give up. Systems step in, but they're so underfunded and overworked, the truth stays buried. And the most heartbreaking part? The most vulnerable kids suffer the most. Poor kids, immigrant kids, foster children, statistically more likely to be abused and far less likely to be protected. These are the very children the Follings preyed on. Brain Cooper says, this isn't ancient history. It's a blueprint for how monsters hide in plain sight. Not under the bed, not in the closet, but as your neighbor, your board member, your Sunday school teacher. So what happened to Margaret Folling? She was never tried, never faced justice. For 13 years, she lived in a secure psychiatric facility, mentally unfit for court. And when she died, she took answers to the grave. But this story isn't just about her. It's about us. About what happens when fear, silence, and "it's not my problem" open the door to unthinkable evil. Don't look away. This isn't a ghost story. It's a mirror. And what you choose to do next might just stop the next Folling. They were the perfect American couple. Churchgoers, board members, smiles at every town gathering. The Follings were the kind of neighbors you'd trust with your children. But behind closed doors they were running one of the most disturbing operations in U.S. history, and no one saw it coming. For 20 years, the Follings hid behind community status, while executing a chilling ritual no one dared question. The truth. It was right in front of everyone the whole time. A doctor raised concerns after a boy was injured. A social worker voiced suspicion. And what happened? Nothing. Every warning was ignored, because no one wanted to believe the friendly couple on Oak Street could be monsters. The neighbor saw something, but didn't want to seem nosy. The official took a vague excuse, because the real explanation was too horrific. And the colleague stayed silent, afraid of risking their career. Each silent choice stacked up. Each ignored clue opened the door wider. And the Follings? They thrived in the shadows. But here's the darkest twist. This wasn't just about the Follings. According to Cooper, the lead investigator, it's still happening today. Different names, different towns, but the same silence, the same indifference, the same broken system. Marginalized children, immigrants, orphans, kids of color. They're still the ones most likely to suffer, and least likely to be saved. And Margaret? She was never even tried. She died in a psychiatric facility, believing she was a prophet. Her final journal entry reads like something out of a horror film. They think they've stopped the mission, but the vessels are filled. Judgment is coming, and they will see I was right. And Howard, he wrote a book from prison titled Blind Trust, painting himself as a man trapped by love. He said, "I'm not the monster. I just love too deeply." But Cooper doesn't buy it for a second. "That's self-serving garbage," he says. Howard wasn't a lovesick fool. He was an accomplice. 25 children, 2 monsters, and a town that let it all happen because the truth was too terrifying to face. Now, the Follings case is studied in classrooms and crime labs. A warning to every community. Sometimes, the monster isn't hiding under your bed. Sometimes, he's mowing his lawn next door. In a quiet American town, the Follings seemed like everyone else. They went to church on Sundays, took part in community events, and Howard served on local boards. They were, to all outward appearances, respected and admired pillars of the community. But behind this carefully constructed image was something darker. Their perfect facade hid horrors that endured for nearly 2 decades. When warnings came, first from Dr. Chun after treating young Thomas, and then from Susan Fletcher, who had observed strange things in the household, they were brushed aside. The town didn't want to believe. A neighbor saw something but stayed silent, not wanting to seem intrusive. An official heard a concern but accepted a vague explanation because the truth was too horrible to face. A co-worker noticed signs but feared risking their job. These small acts of silence, of looking away, built a wall around the Follings crimes. Detective Richard Cooper would later say this wasn't just a case of one monstrous family, but of a community's failure. A failure that allowed abuse to fester, unchallenged. A failure repeated in towns and cities everywhere. Because abuse doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes, it lives right next door. Behind a smile, behind status, behind wealth. And tragically, the children who suffer most, those from poor families, immigrant backgrounds, the foster system, are often those the system fails to protect. Margaret Falling died in 2008, never tried for her crimes, declared mentally incompetent. But until her last breath, she believed she was serving God. In her final journal entry, she claimed the mission continued in a higher realm, that the vessels had been filled, that redemption had been achieved, that she had been chosen. Howard Falling spent his years in prison writing a memoir, Blind Trust, in which he painted himself as a victim, manipulated by the woman he loved. But those who read it, like Cooper, called it nonsense. Howard wasn't passive. He wasn't blind. He was complicit. He stood by, benefited, and allowed the horrors to continue. The damage left behind was irreversible. 25 children abused. Lives shattered. A community left, haunted by what had happened in its very heart. Today, their story is studied by law enforcement and scholars. A cautionary tale of how darkness can grow in plain sight. But it's also sparked change. New laws, sharper protocols, greater awareness. And in the place where the Follings house once stood, a garden grows now. 25 trees, 12 oaks for the redeemable, 13 willows for the vessels, reach for the sky. A living memorial. This story, while steeped in horror, is also a story of courage. Susan Fletcher, who sounded the alarm. Maria Vasquez, who escaped and spoke up. Detective Cooper, who refused to stop digging. And the surviving children, Elizabeth and others, who live on, carrying scars, but still standing. Let their strength remind us, our silence enables evil. Our questions matter. Our willingness to see, to act, to protect, is what keeps the next tragedy from taking root. And let us never forget the names of the lost. Maria, Tyrell, Alex, Lucia, Wayne, Tron, Sarah, Dimitri, and the 5 whose names may never be known, but whose lives mattered just the same. And as the wind moves through the trees in that quiet garden, 25 lives echo in the silence. Some lost, some broken, all changed forever. This has been Sanctified Sin. Until next time, remember, the most important stories are often the ones that are hardest to tell, the ones we'd rather look away from, the ones that demand we listen. Thank you for listening.